sometimes advocating for ourselves and translating this advocacy to communication that is able to bridge the internal signal that gives you feedback on whether something feels good, whether something feels aligned, whether something feels incongruent, whether something feels like it might not be supportive or it might not be the best decision for you. And for that to be able to reach a point of articulation that will enable the authenticity of that message to actually be translated with our words, with a quality of energy that allows those words to be delivered in a way that will create the impact that we want them to have, so that they will be recognized and understood by others. If you have ever experienced this kind of incongruence and a strange, it is a strange experience of maybe saying the words that feel true for you, which might already be difficult, but actually being able to bring yourself to a point of expressing a need or a desire or preference around something, but that the energy of that delivery is speaking to actually what is going on in your nervous system, which might be conflict. It could be actually that the process of visibility and vulnerability is creating shutdown, and it's creating the desire that you want to hide, you want to shrink, you want to make yourself smaller, more quiet, you don't want to be a burden, you don't want to cause any trouble, you don't want to create disagreement, you want to fit into a dynamic socially. That all of that and the weight of all of that actually creates the collapse, and it creates the shrinking, so that you could be saying, no, that doesn't suit me, or that doesn't feel right. But the means by which that is expressed from an energetic transmission point of view actually doesn't serve to empower that language with assertiveness, or doesn't come across in a way that feels certain, assured, grounded, that perhaps the way that that comes across is as an apology, or that you don't believe really what you're saying, or that there's a lack of confidence or trust in what you're saying. That is so difficult. That is such a difficult experience. It's also very difficult to try and translate that and describe that, and to begin to map out what is actually happening. And I've used one example, drawing reference from personal lived experience, and I'm kind of speaking to that through several different lenses, but I've touched on themes there that relate to clarity around one's own needs, clarity around identity, and as a result, preference, clarity around an ultimate desire for some kind of social connection, recognition, or validation of an experience rooted in a kind of quite a primal need for there to be comprehension and exchange to support harmonious relationship, speaking to the kind of awareness of inner world versus outer landscape, and trying to kind of bridge coherence and connection between those places, speaking to a nervous system point of view around, one particular facet of expression, one particular possibility of how something is communicating. So in illustrating that, there's a way to then highlight how many things are going on, what things are being affected, what is true and what is existing in that physical experience, the emotional one, the psychological one, what is happening for us socially, what is happening for us spiritually, philosophically as well. When we start to think about communication and think about expression through these different filters, which do touch on the kind of connection piece and social elements, then we're actually touching on cultural values, personal values, ways of being and expressing and sharing that are coded into society, as well as whatever we are, bringing to the table as complex individuals with a unique lens on the world, unique set of circumstances and life experiences that are shaping our communication needs and our needs for connection. It's a very complex and beautiful, multifaceted way of starting to think about what informs and shapes and influences expression, and trying to then unravel or identify at any given time what is being activated for me right now, what element is most stimulated in this response that I'm having, what part of my experience feels like it is being touched on most deeply, what qualities and what components or archetypes within my sense of identity are making themselves known to me as I attempt to share something that feels true here, but that maybe is really difficult to bring into a fully embodied and empowered realization of that expression in a way that can be clearly understood by someone else. When we're sensitive to the responses of others, the perceived needs of others, when we are highly attuned to the emotional landscape of others, and there are patterns there relationally, which maybe mean that we have prioritized that perception over our own, that there's been such focus on how do we mould and adapt and shift and change and morph our expression to slot neatly into this space so that it can be accepted, and so that I can tick that box of the safety piece, or feeling, like I will get the connection I need, over that prioritization of, is this channel from me to the external space, is that maintaining its shape? Is that holding a quality of continuity that assures me that I am still able to advocate for that part that has actually been able to, maybe only just been able to communicate with oneself enough to be recognized as that. So I'm making that observation there about the fact that we, even in that first instance, need to have been able to cultivate a quality of listening and sensitivity, of self-awareness, that does turn the dial down on the external environment sufficiently enough so that we can recognize, oh, that's me, that's my authentic feeling about this. This is how I really am responding to this. This is what I really want. This is what I feel like I really need. So to even have got to that point can be a struggle. Never mind the process of then, how do we support that and nurture that, and continue to create space around that is kind of, it has a protective quality about it, but inherently a nurturing one that will say, okay, I've heard you, I've got you. Let's try and bring this into the shared space, and to be able to move through that channel, which then, if we're thinking about this as a kind of journey or pathway to realized expression in the external space, what are all of the possible interjections or distortions that can cut across that channel that are out with our control, that are coming from, the external environment, that are coming from different ideas, opinions, social constructs, pressures, all of which, in this quality of trying to cultivate a sensitivity of listening to self, we have simultaneously been turning the dial up on what it's possible to interpret in the external environment. So all of this stuff is quite loud, it's quite distinct, it's a lot of information that it's all coming through. And how do we then continue to create this sense of support and to move forward in spite of these other influences, in spite of these other frequencies, let's say, coming into the space that may create pattern disrupts or jolts for us. If we're using this analogy of frequency, we're really trying to contain this in its own bandwidth, and then there are other things coming in that kind of rupture or can have the potential to rupture that. And that this quality of holding the shape needs to be flexible enough to move in a way that is responsive to this external stimulus, so that it can, adjust and find its flow and find its pathway, to move past potential obstacles, but equally to not then become crushed under the pressure of this holding quality, that the structure then becomes so rigid and armor-like that then actually it may well have traveled the distance and got to this point of outlet to be shared, but that it's so tightly woven now into this kind of protective layer that when it is released, it comes out with great force, and which is part of this need then of, by whatever means and at whatever cost, this voice, this expression, this idea that is mine, and I'm fiercely protecting it because it's mine, it needs to be understood. So then the quality of delivery and how that is released, there's a lot of pressure then suddenly, and it comes full force. So again, this creates potentially a quality of imbalance in terms of what was the intention of how I wanted that piece of information to land, or what was the quality of the delivery that I felt, connected with when that idea first emerged. And by the time we got to the end of that pathway, how true, how much resemblance did the ultimate delivery of that message or that vocalization expression, how much did it match, And this is an interesting idea, because it's not to say that one is good or bad. But it's then about tracking and measuring in our own awareness what feels good. And there is something really affirming about working with and cultivating an expression from its inception to its shared delivery, where something just clicks and it feels right, and you think, yeah, I said it in the way I wanted to say it, or it felt good to say. It felt so aligned, in the sense that there was a clear motion of expression that was able to deliver that communication. It felt so clear. That channel was so open. Or it maybe felt at that end that it had morphed and grown and shifted and changed and shaped into something that came across in an entirely different way. The delivery and the way that it landed, it didn't hit its target. It didn't make its mark in the way that you wanted to, and that you get that feedback because it feels like it was forced, or it feels like the tone didn't match, the words and the tone didn't meet. There wasn't a meshing of those two kind of conceptual things together. And this is another layer of nuance to add to this, is this sense that the way in which our communications are received by others is not within our control. And this is both a challenging truth to accept, but also a kind of humble reminder that all we can do really is try our best. All we can do is attempt to work with our own awareness and sensitivity to expression, and acknowledging our needs and trying our best to honor those by expressing them to ourselves first and foremost, and then taking the steps to try and make those things known to others when we're asked, or when the opportunity presents itself for that desire to be shared, or that opinion at an important moment to be shared. And that's not always a comfortable process, but by practicing that and working with that quality of reflexive communication, we can improve. But this sense of being observed, and how will something be received, and what do I need to do in order to ensure that my communications are met favourably. This is a kind of construct in our socialization that can really trip us up. And this is spoken to in terms of vocal development in kind of early years, when we're thinking about how children change their patterns of communication, because it's about, okay, if I modify the way that my voice sounds and I get positive feedback in response to something that I have asked for or that I want, and start to learn that this is a way for me to get my needs met, you can see this pattern exhibiting itself in really young children, like, oh, I want this, or so that this idea is spoken to in the vocal development perspective, but it's an interesting one to consider of like, does that leave us, or do we just become more sophisticated actually in this adaptation and modification of how am I moulding and shaping myself to fit something that feels acceptable or digestible. And that can become an ingrained pattern or stylistic way of translating what it is that we really feel into, okay, but how will that be interpreted? And therefore, how do I need to adjust this in order to frame this in a way that will be, somebody will be more receptive to it? And that is something that we see in the world of work, in how we speak about presentation in terms of public speaking, or say in an interview dynamic, or high powered performance environments. There is a lot of information out there that is kind of speaking to this quality of working with our intentional communication versus delivery style that is maybe at points not always offering that space of consideration to, okay, if I have an ultimate aim here around how I want something to be interpreted, and that's what I'm working on, rather than strengthening and developing the aspects of my authentic communication that feel a bit neglected or a bit shy or underconfident, do we lose connection with that part of ourselves, or do we start to reduce that sensitivity to that space? Do we start to create a preference for this mode of operation, which is about, okay, well, this is a strategy of communication that I know works in this kind of environment, and therefore that is what I'm going to employ. And that might be very well the suit of armor that you put on to navigate a professional environment. But how does that affect our relationship with ourselves? And how does that affect our relationship with the part that is trying to reach this communication space of, this is what I really feel, this is what I really need, this is what I really want, I am trying to advocate for myself? And does that actually get lost in the noise of the strategic approach, which is outcome focused and outsourcing the power to someone else because it's based on their approval around how something is framed and in what mode or style of communication that message is delivered. So there's so much nuance here, because at the end of the day, we are just speaking about different approaches to training the voice, working with the voice, identity work, parts work, kind of all interwoven with each other, because ultimately voice work of any kind is multifaceted and multidisciplinary, and it has, the beauty of being able to touch on all of these different strands simultaneously. And just positing these questions of, what is the cause and effect, or what happens when I employ this strategy or I try this approach, not to say this is the right way or this is the right way, but just to start asking these kind of questions around if our ultimate aim is to be strengthening and supporting authentic expression, then what are we actually doing to try and achieve that? And are we prepared to do some of the uncomfortable but necessary work of exposure and vulnerability in a way that is actually witnessed by others, and becomes part of that feedback and reference point for, okay, I really see how I am coping with this, or what modifications and adjustments I'm making to try and conceal vulnerability, because I don't want to be exposed or seen to be exposed, and getting like really, really good data on that from doing the uncomfortable work? Or do we opt for an approach which maybe gets us a perceived result in a particular environment that operates with certain principles and expectations around communication that are coded into the very fabric of that space, that are actually inherently woven into interesting power dynamic aspects? And do we play into that, and do we adopt the tools that will help us navigate in that space, and kind of move without necessarily there always being a clear acknowledgement or recognition of the more vulnerable, authentic expression of how we really feel about something, but we get the results and we get the acceptance of that space? Is there a trade-off there? Is there a cost to that? And that's just the kind of the framing that I want to leave you with at the end of this reflection, and coming back full circle to this idea of how prepared we are to confront and acknowledge what is actually arising for us, and that this self-examination that is part and parcel of working with voice and using voice as a kind of mirror to really ask, how am I in my confidence, and how am I in my state of well-being, and how am I creatively, and how am I living? How am I, as an expressive being, how am I moving, walking and talking in the world, and using voice as a mirror for that? Yeah, it's kind of, it can be equivalent to shadow work much of the time, because we get very good feedback, and very specific feedback once we have relevant tools, and lenses to move into more niche areas of focus, and the body being such an amazing instrument of sensitivity to give us all sorts of indications as to what might be going on actually for us. Coming back to the communication of the nervous system, actually, what is happening, what is being expressed right now, what does my body really feel, versus what I might be trying to portray. Really getting to grips with that, and empowering ourselves with a language to be able to name those things from a navigational point of view as well, so that we can start to describe qualities of movement, as well as inherently, qualities of, on a spectrum of, does it feel good or does it not feel good? Can I sit with this? Is it asking me to move and change and adapt? Or am I feeling kind of supported and connected and validated by the feedback that my body instrument is giving me?